What's in a name? Well, William Shakespeare once wrote that a rose by any other name would still smell as sweet. And who am I to disagree? So, let's examine some of the names in our city, and I'll leave it as an exercise for the viewer to figure out if they're sweet. But since one of the fans of my channel told me he's interested in a couple of these names, I think you'll find them interesting too. Hola, estoy en el Avenida Roncesvalles. Now, if you speak Spanish, you've probably already figured out that I don't. Sorry about that, eh? But that doesn't really matter, because even though this street is named after a place in Spain, we don't pronounce it that way. In Toronto, it's called Roncesvalles. Or you can just avoid the whole thing by keeping it cash and using the short form, Roncy. Now let's go have a look at another place that we pronounce differently than in its home country. This is Bermondsey Road. It's named after Bermondsey, an area in London, England. I don't know how Bermondsey turned into Bermondsey, but I do know how the name got here. A cookie company called Peakfriends, based in Bermondsey, opened a factory just down at the other end of this street in 1949, and the street was named after the location of their head office. Peakfriends as a company no longer exists, but the factory is still here. And unlike a lot of factories, being downwind of this one smells wonderful. Now, let's talk about another change in pronunciation, but this time its origins are entirely here. I'm standing in front of Spadina House Museum on Spadina Road. The name comes from the word Spadina, and I apologize if I mispronounced that. My Anishinaabe is even worse than my Spanish. The word means something like hill or ridge, and it refers to the ridge that's at the end of this pathway behind me. That's the shoreline of the former Lake Iroquois. I talked about Lake Iroquois in my video on how Toronto's shoreline has changed since the end of the last ice age. There's a magic link up here, and I'll put a link down in the description so you can find it when you finish watching this video. Now, depending upon how you count, we have at least 2 streets called Spadina in Toronto, and we almost had an expressway by that name. North of Bloor, it's Spadina Road, and there's a break in it at this hill. South of Bloor, it's Spadina Avenue, and there's a gap in that too for Spadina Crescent, where the northbound and southbound lanes of Spadina split to go around a building in the middle of the road. But it's really not a crescent, it's a circle. And the Allen Road had a working title of Spadina Expressway because part of its alignment was supposed to follow Spadina Road. Now, as for the pronunciation of the name, apparently, as Spadina was extended over the years, the lower class residents in the newer parts tended to pronounce it Spadina, while the upper class residents in the older parts continued to pronounce it Spadina. But in the end, the mispronunciation won out. The Spadina House Museum is pronounced the original way, but pretty much everyone else calls the street Spadina. That's enough about pronunciation. Let's go for something completely different. I'm at the intersection of King Street and George Street, and I'm at the intersection of King Street and George Street in Weston, downtown. The current city of Toronto is the result of a long series of amalgamations. This location is in the Old Town. That one was in Weston. Weston was amalgamated into the city of York in 1967, and then York was amalgamated into Toronto in 1998. And there are a lot of duplicate street names as a result of the amalgamations, because let's face it, most places have street names with things like King, Queen, or Maine, or common people names, especially if they're the names of kings or queens, like George or Elizabeth. Most of these duplications have been cleaned up by renaming streets over the years, but as you can see here, not all of them. And it's not just street names that got duplicated either. I'm here in Oriole Park. And I'm here in Oriole Park, on Oriole Parkway, on Don Mills Road. This duplication happened for the same reason. Both Oriole Parks were in different cities before amalgamation. We have a bunch of confusingly similar park names in Toronto. There's Stanley Park North, and Stanley Park South. We have Regent Park Etobicoke, and just for a little extra confusion, we have Regents Park. And then there's Centennial Park Etobicoke, which appeared in my video on landfills, links in the usual places, and Centennial Park in Scarborough. Now, enough of that. let's look at something that people think is a duplicate, but actually isn't. People make fun of the name Avenue Road because avenue, like road, is a word you stick on the end of a street name, like Eglinton Avenue or Shepherd Avenue. And it sounds kind of silly, right? I mean, you wouldn't name a street Street Road or Road Street. But when it comes down to it, avenue actually means a row of trees. And this is not the only avenue road in the English-speaking world. So, Avenue Road would be a road lined with trees. Yeah, that tracks. All right, now let's go visit a location that I mentioned in passing earlier in the video. Behind me is Main Street subway station. It made an appearance in my video on the extremes of Toronto's streetcar system. You know where to find the links. Now, many of Toronto's subway stations are named after the streets they're on, things like Bay or King. But this is the only one that has the word street in its name. Why is that? Well, for one thing, if it was just called Main Station, you might think it's the main station in the system, when by passenger numbers, it's actually somewhere in the middle of the pack. Or you might think it's downtown, which it isn't. It was in downtown East Toronto when East Toronto was a thing, but that ended in 1908, when Toronto annexed East Toronto. Now, did you come here for an argument? Because you could argue that there's one other station that has that same property, and that's Highway 407. After all, the words highway and street both serve the same purpose. They indicate that we're talking about a thoroughfare. But enough arguing. At the start of this video, I mentioned the Shakespeare quote about a rose smelling sweet. So, let's go to where the air is sweet. It's a mostly sunny day, sweeping the clouds away, and I can tell you how to get to Sesame Street. It's right there. But just for good measure, here's a map. Sesame Street runs between Pharmacy Avenue and Huntingwood Drive in Scarborough. I don't want to risk running into any grouches, so let's move along and go to our final location. And if this little street seems like a strange place to end the video, well, that may be because this is Strange Street. Seriously. It's a little street running off Queen Street near Degrassi. Well, I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, you know what to do. Please like and subscribe.